You know, I don't tell this story often. Most nights I keep it buried, somewhere deep where it can't reach me when the lights go low. But tonight, with the fire burning and the wind pressing against those old window panes, I think maybe it's time. So pull your chair in close and listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you happened to me, not to some stranger, not to a friend of a friend, to me, when I was 22 years old and foolish enough to think the world had no edges. It was the autumn of 1971. I was living up in northern Minnesota, not far from the boundary waters, where the forest doesn't just surround you, it watches you. I was working a seasonal job with the forestry service, mapping old-growth timber in areas that hadn't seen much human traffic in decades. The pay was decent, and I liked being alone, or at least I thought I did. My supervisor, Gerald, handed me a sector map on a Tuesday morning and said I'd be working the Redtail Ridge zone for 3 days, solo. There was a ranger cabin out there, just a wood stove, a cot, a lantern, and a hand-drawn map tacked to the wall showing the nearest road, 11 miles south. Gerald told me to radio in each evening at 6 o'clock sharp. He told me that twice. I didn't think much of it at the time. I do now. The hike in was beautiful. October in those northern woods is something that'll stop your breath. The birch trees gone gold, the air carrying that clean, cold smell of pine and distant water. I reached the cabin by early afternoon, ate a tin of beans, and set out for the first grid section. Walk a line, mark a tree, record the species, move on. I'd done it a dozen times before. But around 4 in the afternoon, maybe a mile northeast of the cabin, I crossed a ridge I hadn't seen on any map. Just a long, low rise of dark stone running through the tree line like a spine half buried in the earth. And sitting along that ridge, at intervals I couldn't quite measure, were cairns, stacked stones, deliberately placed, each one about knee height. Old, very old. The lichen was thick and gray-green, the kind that takes 50 years to establish. I crouched beside one and studied it. Something made me not touch it. I don't know why. I just didn't. I noted the ridge in my log and headed back. The sky had gone that bruised purple that comes just before true dark. I got the stove going, I made coffee, and I radioed Gerald at 6 o'clock. He asked if everything was fine. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, longer than felt natural. Then he said quietly, "Stay on the marked paths, son." Nothing else, just that. I told him I understood, and we signed off.
That night I slept fine, or I thought I did. But sometime before dawn, I woke with a feeling I cannot fully explain. A certainty, the way you feel certain when you realize the front door you thought you locked is standing open. I lay still on that cot for what felt like a very long time, listening. The forest outside was completely, absolutely silent. No wind, no owls, no branch settling, nothing. And then, just once, from somewhere out beyond the cabin wall to the north, a sound, low, not quite an animal sound, not quite a human one, somewhere in that terrible space between the two. I did not move for a long time after that. Morning came gray and cold. I went out and did my work. I stayed well south of the ridge. I told myself it had been a dream, or a fox, or some trick of wind through old timber. By midday, I'd nearly convinced myself, and then I found the first track. It was pressed into the soft earth at the bank of a small creek, in a section I was certain no one had walked before me that morning. Large, far larger than a man's boot print, but not quite the print of any animal I recognized either. The shape was elongated, oddly proportioned, with what might have been toe marks pressed deep at the leading edge. I stared at it for a very long time. Then I looked up slowly and scanned the tree line in every direction. Nothing moved. The creek kept running, the trees stood perfectly still, and yet the hair on the back of my neck rose the way it does when you know, without being able to prove it, that something is looking back at you. I radioed Gerald that evening and asked, as casually as I could, whether there was any unusual wildlife activity in Redtail sector he hadn't mentioned. He asked me what I'd seen. I described the print. There was a pause on the line so long I thought the signal had dropped. Then his voice came back, lower and more careful than before. He said, "Finish your grid work tomorrow morning, pack your gear by noon, and walk out. Don't go back to that ridge." I asked him why. He said, "Because there are some places up there that don't belong to us." He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact he has long since stopped questioning. I should have listened. I want to be very clear about that. I should have packed that night and walked 11 miles in the dark and been grateful for every scratch from the brush. But I was 22, and there is a kind of stupidity that only belongs to young men who have not yet been truly frightened. I went back to the ridge.
I reached the ridge around 10 the next morning. The cairns were as I had left them, stretching into the trees in that long, patient line. 14 in total. The last one, at the far end where the stones curved slightly westward, was different from the others, larger. And resting on top of it was something that had not been there 2 days before. A feather. Large, dark, iridescent, not placed carelessly, set there with deliberate precision, its quill wedged between the topmost stones so it would not blow free. It was fresh, placed there that morning, or perhaps in the night in the dark, while I slept 11 miles away in that cabin. I stood very still. The forest around me had gone quiet again. That same absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no settling of branches. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has made all sound stop. I backed away from the cairn slowly, the way you back away from a fire that has grown larger than you expected. I kept my eyes forward. I did not run. I walked, carefully, deliberately, back along the ridge, south through the trees, onto the marked trail, and I did not stop until the cabin was in sight. I packed in 11 minutes, then I walked south, all 11 miles of that old forest road, barely more than 2 faint ruts in the pine duff, and the whole time I had the distinct sensation, I mean this precisely, not as a figure of speech, the distinct sensation that something was keeping pace with me, just inside the tree line to my left, not approaching, not retreating, just keeping pace, learning my rhythm, testing the distance. I never heard it, I never saw it, but I knew it was there the same way you know when a room you've just entered is not empty, even before you found the person standing in the corner. Some things are older than our ability to explain them. I made the highway by late afternoon. A logging truck took me to a town called Ely, and I sat in a diner and drank 3 cups of coffee and stared at the countertop and tried to put words to what had happened. I couldn't then. I'm not sure I fully can now. I filed my sector report the following Monday. I noted the ridge. I noted the cairns. I did not write down the feather. I did not write down the tracks. I did not write down what walked beside me on that road. Gerald read the report in silence, then looked at me over his glasses in a way that told me he already knew. He said only, "Good, you came back," as though the alternative had been a genuine possibility he had been quietly accounting for all along. I've lived a long life since then,
A good one, a full one. I've walked in a lot of wild places, and I have never felt quite that again. But some nights, when the wind changes and the trees outside start moving in a certain way, I find myself listening, really listening, the way I've been listening ever since that morning on the ridge, when I learned that there are things in this world that existed long before our understanding of it, things that do not require our belief to be real, things that will be here long after every road we have ever built has gone back to grass. And they are watching. They are always, always watching. Sleep well, children. Sleep well.